Hello and welcome to tonight's Storyworks Roundtable. Today we are discussing hooks. So hooks in fiction, basically a hook is anything that raises a question in the reader's mind. It's something the reader wants to find out more about, to get answered. So it hooks us into that story and makes us want to turn the page. So there we've got a basic working definition. How many kinds of hooks can you guys think of? Where do we place them?
Well, I suppose the first obvious one is the hook of the book's premise.
The opening hook?
Not
or
even
the
necessarily
premise?
that.
Okay, yeah.
Maybe how it's summed up in the blurb, or if there's a tagline or a logline or something. Star Wars meets the Big Bang Theory or something. Something sort of kind of crazy that thinks, oh, okay, there's some intrigue created.
Right. Okay, cool. So the premise, wow, I feel like we just took the last thing, the caboose, and put it in front of the engine. Because in terms of creative process and writing a story and getting it all down, creating the hook for the reader in that copy is what we do last. But okay, let's run with what you were saying, Robert, because it's actually really cool. Let's make it in front of the engine again. It could be the premise that excites us, that makes us want to write the story. So if we look at it that way, it's like our own hook. Yeah.
That's right. And look, some people do, come up with that sort of, oh, wow, I've got this great idea for a shape-shifting alligator. And it becomes becomes some kind of hook for them.
Yeah. And then you're like, what kind of story can I fit a shape-shifting alligator into?
That's right. That's right. So, yes, I agree. It's a very global way of looking at it, and not necessarily I often will find myself coming back to the blurb hook after the story's been written, yes. But I guess one of the big ones from a reader's point of view is, what's this book going to do for me when they first make a purchase? And so that first hook is probably, it may even be the cover or the title or a combination of the blurb or whatever, but that's what's going to hook you in. And a good way to think about that is, as a writer, what's propelled us to write the story.
Right. Yeah, and I love that piece of it from a craft perspective, because I think the blurb does have to come at the end of the writing process. It's really a post-production piece of it. It's a marketing piece of it, but of course it should connect to everything that comes through the book. So if we're just thinking, what's hooked me into writing it, that should be something that hooks a reader into it as well. If it's exciting for you, it should be exciting for at least a few other people, right? Who will go buy our books. Definitely. Okay, cool. So we've got the premise as a hook. What's the next hook? Let's do them.
You could go with the opening hook, which is your plot's entire hook, the hook of your story, the conflict. And that kind of happens in the first, hopefully, sentence, paragraphs, chapter section of your novel, where you kind of get readers to kind of buy in completely, rather than like the book description gets them interested. That first chapter gets them whether or not they're going to read the rest of the book or not. So
right. So the opening hook would be the next hook that a reader is going to encounter, or that you, in theory, are going to write. Of course, beginnings of books are often the most revised of any section, because that opening hook is so hard to get right. And often we start writing in the wrong place. We start writing with what should really be some backstory or some setup, when what we need to do is start, drop the reader right in the middle of some action with that opening hook. Yeah.
Right. Cool. Right into the beginning of the conflict, or the beginning of the trouble that the protagonist is going to encounter. Which raises the questions, the hooks of what is going to happen next and how are they going to get out of it, or, the intriguing things that are happening that make the reader want to continue.
Right. So then after the opening hook, we have the chapter hooks. So at the end of each chapter should compel the reader to stay up all night instead of putting in the bookmark. Right. So the chapter hooks And then at the end of the book, you've got the resolution. And if it's a series, you've got a closing hook, something that connects one train car to the next. Or even if it's a standalone book, it might not be a hook per se, but it's something that's going to resonate with the reader, that kind of open-ended piece. So the plot is resolved, but there's that aspect of the character's arc or some relationship that's involved in a subplot that lets us keep ruminating about what's next for this character, or where could the story go after this. Yeah.
Imagining there's something still happening for them.
Right. So, okay, so we've got the premise, the opening hook, the chapter hooks, and then the closing hook. So 4 hooks.
Yeah.
Yay. All right. There you go.
I really like how you described it right there, where you talk about it being the questions that you raise for the reader. I think sometimes we get so hooked on semantics, like the words that we use for things, that sometimes we box ourselves in. And I like opening it up to feeling like that's just the questions that the reader's going to have. How did this happen, or why is this happening, or anything that the reader reads through. And because I think myself especially, I get really stuck on, is this hooky enough? Is this, compelling enough? Does this grab the reader enough? Whereas I think thinking of it in a broader, more like, it's just a question that we're raising that they're going to want to know the answer to. It kind of takes the pressure off.
Yeah, it does. And you don't want anything about your story to be too formulaic. You don't want to force feed stuff down the reader's throat. And if you're writing a nice family story that is, sentimental, you're going to have sentimental hooks because that's what your reader is there for. You aren't going to have, slamming doors or explosions or something. One of the examples I like to use when I'm teaching is, I think it's chapter 3 of Anne of Green Gables. It might be chapter 2, but I think it's 3. Anne is brought home to the Cuthberts' house, and Marilla, the spinster lady of the house, says, "We wanted a boy. This orphan has to go back to the orphanage." But it's too late to send her back, so poor Anne. The chapter closes with her crying herself to sleep. And it's a very sentimental, touching moment. It's not sappy. It's just, very touching. But it still creates a hook because the reader wants to know, how is this going to turn out for Anne? We know she won't be sent back because the house is called Green Gables and the book is Anne of Green Gables. So the hook there is, how will Anne turn this around and get to stay? And that's a very compelling hook.
Right.
Yep.
I think we get caught up in those action beat hooks and the things at the end of chapters where you want your reader to be like, is your protagonist going to die, or, what's going to happen? And then when you start doing that too often, then it becomes hokey and not effective either. Right.
Well, and it has a desensitization effect on the reader, just like we get desensitized to stuff in real life. If you are a nurse or something, you're going to get pretty used to seeing bodily fluids and it's not going to gross you out, right? Whereas the rest of us are going to be like, ew, I can't touch that. Right. I can't go near that, right? Or a dentist sticking fingers in people's mouths. It's no big deal because you're so used to it. So in your stories, you want those high points to be high. And if everything is coming across as an 8 or a 9, an 8 or a 9, that 10 isn't going to feel like a 10. It's going to feel like a 3, So you've got to really have variety and movement through your story, from the subtle to the gross.
I think that's I think that's a really good point, that hooks don't always equate to drama, sort of dramatic action. A hook is, as you say, is raising an unconscious reason in the reader's head as to why they want to move on, why they want to know what happens next. And I've always made that my own rule for writing is, do I want to read what happens next? Am I writing something where the reader wants to know what happens next? And I guess at some level, then that's always being hooky to some description. I like Kathryn's idea. Is it hooky enough? I can just imagine this sort of extreme between hookiness and suckiness. There's a kind of
love it.
Hookometer, where one end is really hooky, the other end is really sucky.
Right. Well, and you've got to have that past the hook where you've gone too far and you're just like in the red.
Yeah, that's right. Oh no, I've gone over hooky.
Danger. Yes. Yeah, well, okay, let's make a little distinction here. Because everything, as you're saying, Robert, needs to be compelling. It needs to compel us emotionally and intellectually to keep wanting to read the story. But a hook can be this very specific thing that we actually work into the architecture of the story, and it creates intrigue that needs to be answered. So not everything that's compelling needs to be answered, just like feeling for the orphan crying herself to sleep. That could be compelling, but it's the question raised that is the hook, is how will she turn this around? Right? So then we need to see the story fulfill that promise of showing us how Anne will turn it around. So the hook raises a question that the author promises to answer. It creates an expectation in the reader. By turning the page, I will answer this question.
Yes, maybe at the end of the book, in which case you'll stay up all night or miss your bus stop.
Right.
But at some point, yeah, definitely. And it's that you can tell the difference then between where a book is really well written, where you don't even really notice the hook. You just want to keep reading because you want the story to unfold.
Right.
So something has hooked us in, and we don't necessarily know what it is. Whereas perhaps the clumsy methods are where the hook is just sort of too melodramatic, or as you say, doesn't fit the story genre or the story style or the voice even.
Right.
As you say, the family drama, and then all of a sudden, a car crashes through the wall or something.
Yes. Yes, and then you'd be asking yourself, is this a farce? What story did I just walk into here?
That's right. It would change what you thought of the book, what you thought of the story. I really like. I mean, thinking about it also from a sort of commercial point of view. There's real value to being able to write so well that your first sentence or paragraph is a really great hook for everything that the story is about, and that's something that I strive to do. Not because I think it's commercially smart to do, but I do love that. I've been reading the Dresden Files series recently, and Jim Butcher's first lines are they're usually exquisite, and they kind of pack so much in there. What we would call semantically packed, where that first sentence is stuffed with things to do with objects that are very key to him, to his style, to his character, and to even the premise. Where it wasn't the first explosion that caught the Blue Beetle or me upside down, but the vampire that came on the roof. You think, whoa, immediately
Right.
you're in the action, and it's totally true to the style of the series, of course. So you're kind of expecting that you're starting inside action, but he does it not with just action for action's sake. It literally propels the whole story, and then before you know it, you're halfway through, and it's 2:00 in the morning.
Nice. I like how there was a twist there, from the car to the vampire. Oh, that just got different. That just went somewhere else.
And that's not even I just made that up, but that's what they're like. They start with some kind of action that doesn't necessarily lead exactly where you think it's going to be, and so he's very clever at those melodramatic moments that are not just sort of base hooky, but but they've got that sophisticated hook to them that twists even further. And I think that's looking for as a writer, not necessarily in the action sense of that Jim Butcher always does it, but looking for how can I take this hook further and make it even more interesting to the reader.
Right. Well, and there are different types of opening hooks as well. That's an action, paranormal, urban fantasy, or whatever, right? But if you're writing like Saturday, which I mentioned before by Ewan McGregor. I always do that. I know I did this before on a previous episode. Crap, it's Ewan somebody, right? No, McEwan. Ian McEwan. Sewan or McEwen, whatever. Anyway.
Ian McEwen McGregor. He'll do.
Yeah, that guy. Anyway, it opens with this passage of narrative description, and we watch this man get out of bed in the morning. It's like 3 or 4 in the morning, so his wife's asleep, and he goes to the window and he looks outside at the square his house sits on, and there's no drama, there's no action. It's just a man getting out of bed, and we're learning about him and his life. But it still functions as a hook because it's appropriate to the voice of this piece and to this genre. And there is tension because everything being described about this guy's life is so perfect. He just has it all going on, So the tension that we read between the lines is what's about to change, because we know it's not going to stay perfect.
So the hook is that there's an implied meticulous nature to the character and some sense of overriding tension that the author has managed to introduce that lets you think that might change sometime soon.
Right. Well, part of that is the nature of story, because you aren't going to pick up, a 300-page book and read, this guy's so perfect. He's a brain surgeon, and his wife is beautiful, and his kids are intelligent, and his house is lovely, and his neighborhood is affluent. That would be really boring for 300 pages. So you start reading about how perfect and wonderful this is, and then without the author stating it, you're just like, oh, what's coming? This is all going to crumble down. Something is going to shake up this guy's life, because that is the promise of story. And of course there's cover art and a blurb, and so you have a certain expectation there as well. But when you craft that opening, like you were saying, Kathryn, you can get caught up in the idea of creating the hook and being hooky, and is it hooky enough? Yes, you need to grab your reader, but you need to do it in a way appropriate to the story that you're telling, and that might have nothing to do with action. Right. So
this is making me think about the opening lines of Pride and Prejudice, which everyone knows about, the universal truth about a man wanting a wife, and then how Pride and Prejudice goes right in. I mean, that exactly what's coming in terms of the story, but you also have the question of, okay, now we've got how many girls? How's this going to work? And so that's your immediate question right off the bat. But that's just a narrative, like it's just stated at the beginning, so there's so many different ways that you can use that opening hook that, again, are right for the genre, that doesn't have to be cheesy or chintzy or shoved in there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you were starting to touch on theme earlier, Robert. And how that opening hook, you were saying how those opening sentences can kind of encapsulate what the book is about, right? So that notion of theme should be present in the opening hook. You're inviting a reader to walk through a door and enter a world, and you don't want to misrepresent that with the thing that grabs the reader, because if you do, then it kind of feels like a bait and switch. So in Saturday, or in Pride and Prejudice, or in the Dresden Files, right? It's all appropriate, and it's all, saying to the reader, here's the world you're about to enter. It's going to be crash, boom, paranormal action. It's going to be, a parlor romance. It's going to be whatever, right? So that's really important to crafting your hook, is being true to your story and your theme.
And that's a good point, because you might end up in first draft writing, and as you say, it's often revised dramatically, that opening chapter or first few paragraphs. You might end up writing something which you think is a great hook, but then as the book evolves, it doesn't really necessarily relate to the premise. And I've done this, been guilty of this, where you start, this would be a great opening moment, and then you realise it might be of interest to the character, which is fine. So let's say, some woman gets stopped by the police and issued a speeding ticket on the way back home on a rainy night, and she misses dinner with her husband. Right, okay, interesting. It could be a hook. But if the entire story is about something not related to that, then it's just a piece of action that propels. So it could just be as much throat clearing as describing the weather, even though it's got momentum and pace. If it's not relevant to the whole story plot, or you can't hook it back in.
Right.
But that doesn't mean to say that when you come back and revise it, you can't introduce something that then leads to that thread of the premise. So it then turns into something. So you don't necessarily discard everything. You think, oh no, that is a hook, but it doesn't relate. Well, how can I make it relate? How can I make it relevant to that overall question of the plot or where the story is heading?
Right. And something writers hear a lot from workshops or critique groups is that they're starting the story way too early. The story starts on page 9 or 15, not where the writer has page 1, because we get our wheels turning by doing that throat clearing. We're doing the world building and we're doing the setup and we're introducing the characters. But all of that stuff can be woven into the story after the action starts. Really, you've got to do it. You've got to make it happen, but you're going to get the reader by starting with the action, not with the introductions. That you've got to, weave the introductions into the action to make it effective.
Totally. We're all nodding at each other.
Yeah, I know.
We know hooks so well. It's completely hooked.
Great for audio.
A lot.
Let the nodding begin. Yeah. So anything else about opening hooks?
No.
All right. I think we are going to end this one, but maybe we'll do a part 2 and talk about chapter hooks and ending hooks another day. So thank you so much for joining us today. This has been Storyworks Roundtable. You can find more about us and other episodes at storyworkspodcast.com.